My fiancé accidentally sent me a text message meant for his mother. When I read it, I almost fainted. The message said, "Don't worry, Mom, once we're married, her inheritance will cover everything. The wedding's just the beginning." I stared at my phone screen, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped it. 3 years of my life, an engagement ring that felt suddenly heavy on my finger, and a wedding planned for 3 weeks from now, all of it crashed down in that single moment of his carelessness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain was hammering against the windows of our Pearl District townhouse when that text arrived. I had been sitting at the kitchen island, reviewing fabric samples for the reception table runners, completely absorbed in choosing between champagne and blush tones. My phone buzzed with what I assumed would be Derek's usual sweet message about picking up dinner on his way home from the office. Instead, those words appeared on my screen, and the world tilted sideways. "My name is Natalie Harper, and until 48 hours ago, I thought I was living a fairy tale. I'm an architect at Klein Associates, one of Portland's most prestigious design firms. At 32, I had built a career I was proud of, purchased my own home with money I had saved and invested wisely, and met a man who seemed to worship the ground I walked on. Derek Anderson swept into my life 3 years ago at a charity fundraiser for urban green spaces. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in my work designing sustainable community housing. Our first date lasted 7 hours. Our second date never really ended because we spent the entire weekend together exploring Powell's City of Books and hiking through Forest Park. When Derek proposed to me last year on the Willamette River overlook at sunset, with the entire city spread out below us in golden light, I genuinely believed I had found my person. The ring was perfect, a 2-carat princess-cut diamond that caught the light beautifully. He had tears in his eyes when he asked me to spend forever with him. I said yes without hesitation, already imagining our future together. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have possibly understood, was that Derek had been conducting research. Not the romantic kind where you learn your partner's favorite flowers or the exact way they like their coffee. No, Derek had been systematically investigating my financial situation from the moment we met. My townhouse that I mentioned casually was worth over $1 million in Portland's inflated market. My position at the firm came with a substantial salary and profit sharing. And then there was the inheritance. My parents died in a car accident when I was 25. It was the worst period of my life, a grief so profound that even now, 7 years later, certain songs or the smell of my mother's perfume can reduce me to tears. They left everything to me and my sister Grace. The life insurance, their savings, the sale of their home in the suburbs, their investment portfolio, all of it split between us. My half came to roughly $800,000. I had been careful with that money, treating it as sacred because it was all I had left of them. I invested most of it, used some for the down payment on my townhouse, and kept a portion liquid for emergencies and opportunities. 6 months ago, Derek suggested we should combine our resources for the wedding. He painted this beautiful picture of us starting our married life as true partners, sharing everything equally. His startup was doing well, he assured me, and he wanted to contribute fully to our special day. I was touched by his enthusiasm and agreed to open a joint account specifically for wedding expenses. I transferred $75,000 into that account, money I had earmarked from my inheritance for this exact purpose. Derek added $15,000, or so he claimed. The wedding planning consumed my evenings and weekends. Rachel Simmons, our wedding planner, was efficient but expensive. The venue alone, Pittock Mansion with its stunning views and historic architecture, cost $20,000 for the day. The catering for 200 guests, the photographer whose portfolio made me cry with its beauty, the string quartet, the flowers, it all added up quickly. Every time I expressed concern about the mounting costs, Derek would squeeze my hand and remind me that we only get married once, that our families and friends deserve to witness something spectacular, that I deserved my dream day. His mother Patricia was involved in every decision, which should have been my first warning sign. She had opinions about everything from the invitation font to the flavor of the wedding cake. At first, I found her enthusiasm endearing. My own mother wasn't there to help me navigate these choices, and having Patricia's input felt like gaining a second chance at that mother-daughter wedding planning experience I had lost. She would drive up from Eugene every weekend, arriving at our townhouse with magazines and Pinterest boards and an endless supply of suggestions. But there were moments, small instances that I dismissed at the time, where something felt off. The way Patricia's eyes would sweep over my home, cataloging and calculating. How she would ask seemingly innocent questions about my job, my salary, my benefits package. The time she casually inquired about whether I had received anything from my parents, and when I mentioned the inheritance, the way her expression shifted to something I couldn't quite identify. Derek had laughed it off, saying his mother was just old-fashioned and believed in knowing the full picture of her children's lives. 3 weeks before the wedding, with most of the deposits paid and the final payments looming, Derek started acting strange. He was on his phone constantly, texting at odd hours and stepping out of rooms to take calls. When I asked about it, he blamed work stress. His startup was going through a crucial funding round, he explained, and investors were demanding and unpredictable. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. I was so focused on seating charts and final dress fittings that I didn't press harder. Then came yesterday afternoon. I had left work early because of a migraine, something that happens when I'm stressed and not sleeping well. The wedding anxiety had been building, normal pre-wedding jitters amplified by the sheer scale of what we had planned. I came home, took medication, and settled on the couch with my laptop to review some last-minute vendor confirmations. My phone was charging in the bedroom, so when it buzzed with incoming messages, I didn't hear it immediately. An hour later, after my headache had subsided to a dull throb, I retrieved my phone. There were several messages from Caroline, my best friend and maid of honor, asking about the bachelorette party details. There was a reminder from Rachel about the final walkthrough at Pittock Mansion scheduled for tomorrow. And then there was the message from Derek, except it clearly wasn't meant for me. The text read exactly as I described: "Don't worry, Mom, once we're married, her inheritance will cover everything. The wedding's just the beginning." But it was the follow-up message, sent 3 minutes later, that made my blood run cold. "Delete that. Sent to wrong person." I sat there on my bed, staring at those words until they blurred. My brain was trying to process what I was reading, trying to find an innocent explanation that would make this okay. Maybe he meant something else. Maybe it was taken out of context. Maybe there was a reasonable interpretation where my fiancé wasn't essentially admitting to his mother that he was marrying me for my money. But I'm an architect. My job requires me to see structures clearly, to understand how foundations support everything built upon them. And the foundation of my relationship, I was suddenly realizing, might have been rotten from the very beginning. I thought back through our 3 years together with new eyes. How we had met at that charity fundraiser, but Derek had asked the organizers about me before approaching. How quickly he had moved our relationship forward, always pushing for the next milestone. How enthusiastic he had been about moving into my townhouse instead of finding a place together. How he had never really contributed proportionally to our shared expenses, always having excuses about cash flow and pending deals. The inheritance question from Patricia took on a sinister new meaning. The joint wedding account that I had funded with $75,000 while Derek's contribution had been minimal. His insistence on an expensive wedding when I had initially suggested something smaller and more intimate. Every decision, every moment, suddenly looked different when viewed through the lens of calculation rather than love. I needed to think clearly. My hands were shaking, my heart was racing, but I forced myself to take deep breaths and consider my next move carefully. Confronting Derek immediately would give him time to construct explanations and excuses. Calling off the wedding in a panic might be what I ultimately did, but I needed to know the full truth first. How deep did this betrayal go? Was it just opportunistic financial advantage, or was there more I didn't know? I opened my laptop and created a new folder, titling it simply Documentation. Then I began screenshotting everything. The text messages from Derek. Our joint bank account statements showing the disparate contributions. Emails about wedding expenses. I went through our shared cloud storage and found folders I hadn't paid much attention to before, including one labeled Financial Planning, that contained spreadsheets I had never seen. When I opened them, my stomach turned. Derek had created detailed projections of our combined assets after marriage. He had estimated my inheritance amount, my home equity, my retirement accounts, even my projected earnings over the next decade. There were calculations about how long we would need to stay married before a divorce would net him a significant portion of assets. There were notes about community property laws in Oregon and strategies for maximizing his position. This wasn't a man planning a life with me. This was a man executing a long-term financial strategy where I was nothing more than a target. The spreadsheet was dated 2 months after we met. He had been planning this from almost the very beginning. I closed the laptop before I could see any more, afraid I might actually be sick. My phone rang, Derek's face appearing on the screen with that photo I loved of him laughing at something I had said during a weekend trip to the coast. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I turned the phone to silent and watched it light up with his attempts to reach me. Finally, a text appeared, "Nat, please call me. I can explain. It's not what you think." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But it was exactly what I thought, and probably worse than what I had discovered so far. I needed help. I needed perspective from someone I could trust absolutely. I called my sister Grace, who lived across town in the Hawthorne district. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and happy, probably expecting wedding-related chatter. Instead, I said, "Grace, I need you to come over right now. Don't tell anyone. Just come." My voice must have conveyed the urgency because she didn't ask questions, just said she would be there in 20 minutes. While I waited for Grace, I did something I had never done before in our relationship. I went through Derek's belongings. His laptop was password protected, but his iPad was logged in and synced. I found email chains between him and Patricia that made everything crystal clear. They had discussed me like I was a business acquisition. Patricia had researched my family, found the obituaries from my parents' accident, estimated the likely inheritance. She had encouraged Derek to pursue me aggressively, to lock things down quickly before I might meet someone else or become suspicious. There were emails about the wedding expenses where Patricia actually congratulated Derek on getting me to fund most of it myself. "You're playing this perfectly," she had written. "Let her plan her dream wedding on her dime, and then you'll have access to everything else after the marriage." There were discussions about his startup, which apparently wasn't doing nearly as well as he had told me. In fact, it was failing, bleeding money, and Derek was desperate for an influx of capital that he couldn't access any other way. The most damning discovery was an email thread from 2 months ago where Derek discussed his actual relationship status with someone named Vanessa Kent. The emails were flirtatious, intimate, filled with inside jokes and references to shared memories. He called her V and signed his messages with "Always yours." They had apparently dated for 5 years before breaking up shortly before Derek met me, and from what I could piece together from the messages, they had never really ended things. They were still seeing each other, still planning a future together, still in love. Vanessa knew about me. She knew about the engagement. And she was fine with it because Derek had promised her that once he had secured the financial stability through marrying me, he would find a way to transition back to her. They joked about it, actually laughed in their messages about how clueless I was, how easy it had been to manipulate me. There was a message from just last week where Derek told Vanessa he loved her and couldn't wait until they could stop pretending. I was going to be sick. I barely made it to the bathroom before my stomach revolted, and I found myself on the cold tile floor, shaking and crying and trying to process the complete demolition of everything I thought I knew about my life. This wasn't just about money. It was about 3 years of lies, of manipulation, of a man who had looked me in the eye every single day and performed love while planning my exploitation. The doorbell rang. Grace. I pulled myself together enough to let her in, and the moment she saw my face, she knew something catastrophic had happened. I handed her my phone with Derek's text still displayed and watched as she read it, her expression moving from confusion to horror to rage in rapid succession. "Tell me everything," she said, and I did. Every discovery, every email, every spreadsheet, every message with Vanessa. Grace listened without interrupting, her jaw getting tighter and her eyes getting harder with each revelation. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before saying, "We're going to destroy him." I had never heard that tone from my sister before. Grace was a high school teacher, kind and patient by nature. But something in her had shifted, some protective fury unleashed by seeing me so thoroughly betrayed. She pulled out her own phone and started making calls. The first was to her friend Daniel Reed, who worked as a private investigator. The second was to Marcus Webb, a lawyer she knew from a school board case. Both agreed to meet with us that evening. By the time Daniel Reed and Marcus Webb arrived at my townhouse that evening, I had moved past the initial shock and entered a state of cold clarity. Grace had made coffee and laid out every piece of evidence I had gathered on the dining room table like we were preparing for a trial, which I suppose we were in a way. Daniel was in his mid-40s with graying temples and the kind of observant eyes that seemed to catalog everything in a room within seconds of entering. Marcus was younger, sharp-dressed in a way that suggested he won cases and charged accordingly for the privilege. Daniel picked up my phone first, reading through Derek's messages with a practiced neutrality that somehow made the betrayal feel more real. When someone whose job is uncovering deception looks at your evidence without surprise, you know you're dealing with something worse than a misunderstanding. He asked permission to forward the screenshots to his secure email, then moved on to the laptop, scrolling through the financial spreadsheets with occasional low whistles that punctuated the silence. Marcus was reading the email exchanges between Derek and Patricia, his expression growing darker with each exchange. After several minutes, he set down the iPad and looked at me directly. "This is fraud," he said simply. "What he's done constitutes intentional misrepresentation with the purpose of financial gain. The emails discussing you as a target, the spreadsheets calculating asset division before marriage, the continued relationship with another woman while engaged to you, this goes beyond just being a terrible person. This is legally actionable." I felt something shift inside me at those words. For the past few hours, I had been drowning in hurt and betrayal, feeling like a fool for not seeing the truth sooner. But Marcus's clinical assessment reframed everything. I wasn't stupid for trusting someone I loved. I was the victim of a calculated scheme. The shame I had been feeling started transforming into something else entirely, something sharper and more focused. Daniel pulled out a small notebook and began asking questions in a methodical way that suggested he had done this many times before. How long had Derek and I been together? When did he move into my home? What financial arrangements had we made? Did I have documentation of the wedding account deposits? Had there been any jointly purchased assets? With each answer, he made notes in what looked like shorthand, occasionally asking Grace to clarify details about family history or timeline. Then he asked about Vanessa Kent, and I realized I knew almost nothing about her beyond what I had read in those emails. Derek had mentioned an ex-girlfriend early in our relationship, someone he had dated seriously but claimed it had ended badly and he preferred not to discuss it. I had respected that boundary, never pressing for details, never feeling threatened by someone from his past. Now I wondered what else he had kept hidden behind reasonable-sounding requests for privacy. Daniel pulled out his phone and spent several minutes typing rapidly. Then he showed me his screen, a social media profile for Vanessa Kent. She was beautiful in a polished way, with dark hair styled in beachy waves and photos that suggested a lifestyle of boutique fitness classes and wine tastings. Her profile said she worked in pharmaceutical sales and lived in downtown Portland. Several of her recent photos were taken at locations I recognized, places Derek had told me he was meeting clients or working late at the office. Grace leaned over my shoulder to look at the profile and made a sound of disgust. She was at that restaurant on Burnside. The one Derek said was a business dinner last month. I remembered that night clearly because I had wanted to join him, but he insisted it was a boring work obligation and I would be miserable. Instead, he had been with Vanessa, maintaining their relationship while I planned our wedding. Marcus cleared his throat, pulling our attention back to the immediate legal situation. "Here's what we're dealing with," he began, his tone shifting into what I assumed was his courtroom voice. "Oregon is not a community property state, which works in your favor. Assets acquired before marriage remain separate unless explicitly commingled. Your townhouse, your inheritance, your retirement accounts, all of that is yours alone since you're not married yet. The joint wedding account is trickier because you both have access, but we have clear documentation of disproportionate contributions. He pulled out his own tablet and began creating what he called an action plan. First priority was protecting my assets immediately. He wanted me to contact my bank first thing in the morning and remove Derek's access to the joint account, then transfer my remaining funds back to my personal account. Second, I needed to change all my passwords for banking, investment accounts, email, everything Derek might have access to. Third, we needed to document everything in his possession that belonged to me and everything of his that remained in my home. Daniel interjected with his own list of investigative steps. He wanted to conduct surveillance on Derek for the next week to document his movements, particularly any meetings with Vanessa or his mother. He wanted to dig deeper into Derek's financial situation and his startup company to understand the full scope of his desperation. He also suggested examining Derek's background more thoroughly, because in his experience, people who ran schemes like this rarely did it for the first time. The efficiency with which they dissected my ruined relationship was both comforting and disturbing. On one hand, having professionals treat this seriously and map out concrete steps made me feel less helpless. On the other hand, the fact that they had such ready frameworks for this kind of deception suggested it was far more common than I wanted to believe. Grace asked the question I had been avoiding. What about the wedding? It's 3 weeks away. The weight of that reality pressed down on the room. 200 guests had received invitations. Most had already sent gifts that were stacked in my spare bedroom. The deposits were paid, the dress was altered, the hotel blocks were reserved. My colleagues at the firm were planning to attend. Derek's entire family would be there. The thought of canceling felt overwhelming, but the thought of actually marrying him felt impossible. Marcus was blunt in his assessment. You cancel it. Today if possible, tomorrow at the latest. Every day you wait is another day he can move money, hide assets, or create problems. More importantly, every day you wait is another day you have to pretend. He softened slightly, seeing my expression. I know it feels humiliating. I know you're worried about what people will think or say. But I promise you that the temporary embarrassment of canceling a wedding is nothing compared to the permanent disaster of going through with it. He was right, I knew he was right, but the logistics felt staggering. I would have to tell everyone. Family, friends, colleagues, vendors. I would have to return gifts and cancel reservations and notify the venue. My mind spun with the endless list of phone calls and explanations and awkward conversations. Grace must have seen me starting to spiral because she grabbed my hand firmly. We'll help with all of it, she said. You're not doing this alone. I'll call Mom's sisters, they'll help with family notifications. Caroline can handle the bridal party. We'll divide up the vendor calls. Daniel suggested we move quickly on another front as well. He wanted to set up cameras in my townhouse before Derek came home tonight. Small, discreet ones that would record any interactions we had, anything he said or did once he realized I knew the truth. In cases like this, he explained, people often revealed more than they intended when confronted. They made threats, they admitted to things they shouldn't, they showed their true character. All of that could be valuable documentation. The idea of recording Derek in our home felt invasive and wrong, but then again, he had been recording every detail of my finances in his spreadsheets. He had been documenting my worth while pretending to love me. The invasion had already happened. I was just gathering evidence of it now. I agreed to everything they suggested because I didn't know what else to do. My training as an architect had taught me that when a structure was fundamentally unsound, you didn't try to patch it. You tore it down and built something new on solid ground. My relationship with Derek was unsound in every possible way. It needed to be demolished completely. Daniel left to get his surveillance equipment while Marcus drafted formal notifications to send to Derek and his mother. Grace started a spreadsheet of everyone who needed to be contacted about the wedding cancellation, organizing them by priority and relationship. I sat at my dining room table surrounded by all this activity and felt strangely detached, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart from a safe distance. My phone kept buzzing with messages from Derek. They had evolved from, "Please call me," to, "I'm getting worried," to, "Why aren't you answering," to increasingly frantic declarations that he could explain everything. I hadn't responded to any of them. Let him worry. Let him panic. Let him experience even a fraction of what I was feeling. Daniel returned within the hour carrying a nondescript black bag. He moved through my townhouse with professional efficiency, installing tiny cameras in the living room, kitchen, and entryway. Each one was no bigger than a button and virtually invisible once positioned. He showed me the app on his phone where all the feeds appeared, then helped me install the same app on mine. Now I could watch my own home from anywhere, could review footage, could document whatever happened next. By the time they left, it was nearly midnight. Grace offered to stay, but I sent her home with promises that I would call if I needed anything. The truth was I needed to be alone to process what had happened and what was coming. I walked through my townhouse, this space I had bought with my own money and filled with things I had chosen. Derek's presence was everywhere. His jacket on the hook by the door. His running shoes by the entryway. His laptop bag on the chair. His half of the closet full of expensive clothes I now realized he probably couldn't actually afford. I started gathering his belongings into boxes. Not packing them carefully or with any consideration, just removing them from my space. Every item I touched felt contaminated by his deception. The watch I had given him for his birthday last year. The coffee maker he claimed to have purchased but had probably put on a credit card he couldn't pay off. The framed photo of us from our trip to Cannon Beach, both of us laughing at something that didn't matter anymore. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I heard his key in the lock. I had been waiting in the living room, boxes stacked around me, the weight of everything I now knew sitting heavy in my chest. Derek came through the door looking exhausted and stressed, his tie loosened and his hair disheveled. He saw me sitting there surrounded by his things, and his face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Relief, confusion, fear, then a forced attempt at normalcy. "Hey, I've been trying to reach you all day," he said, his tone aiming for casual concern but landing somewhere near desperate. "Is everything okay? Why are you packing my stuff?" I just looked at him, this man I had planned to marry in 3 weeks, this person I thought I knew completely. Every mannerism now seemed like performance. The slight tilt of his head that used to seem endearing now looked calculated. The concerned expression that used to make me feel cared for now registered as manipulation. "Natalie, you're scaring me. What's going on?" He moved toward me but stopped when I held up my hand. "You sent me a text message today," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "It was meant for your mother. You want to try explaining that, or should I just show you everything else I found?" I watched his face pale, watched him realize exactly how badly he had messed up. His mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. "That text, it wasn't what it looked like. I was just reassuring my mom that we're financially stable. She worries about these things." "Don't," I cut him off. "Don't insult me by lying anymore. I found the spreadsheets, Derek. The ones where you calculated my net worth 2 months after we met. I found the emails with your mother planning this whole thing. I found the messages with Vanessa." That last one hit him like a physical blow. He actually stumbled back a step, his hand reaching for the wall to steady himself. "I can explain all of this," he started, but his voice had lost its conviction. "You can explain how you've been running a con on me for 3 years. How you've been sleeping with your ex-girlfriend while planning our wedding. How you and your mother discussed me like I was an investment opportunity." My voice was rising despite my intention to stay calm. "Please, Derek, explain how any of that has an innocent interpretation." He tried. For the next 20 minutes, he actually tried to construct explanations that might make sense. The spreadsheets were just him being financially responsible, making sure we would be stable together. The emails with his mother were taken out of context, she was just excited about the wedding. Vanessa was a friend, nothing more, I was misreading the tone of their messages. Each excuse was more ridiculous than the last, and he seemed to know it even as the words left his mouth. I let him talk himself in circles, let him dig the hole deeper, all while the cameras Daniel had installed captured every word. When he finally ran out of explanations and stood there looking defeated, I spoke again. The wedding is cancelled. You need to move out of my house. I've already contacted a lawyer, and you'll be hearing from him about the money you need to return to the joint account. You have until the end of the week to collect your things, and then I'm changing the locks. His demeanor shifted then, the mask of the concerned fiancé finally slipping completely. You can't just kick me out. I live here too. And good luck explaining to everyone why you're calling off the wedding. What are you going to tell them? That you went through my private messages and emails like some kind of paranoid psycho? There it was, the real Derek underneath all the charm. Defensive, aggressive, turning it around to make me the villain in his story. I stood up from the couch, and he must have seen something in my expression because he actually took a step back. I'm going to tell them the truth, I said quietly. That I discovered my fiancé was marrying me for my inheritance while maintaining a relationship with another woman. I'm going to tell them that you and your mother planned this from the beginning. I'm going to tell them everything, Derek, because unlike you, I don't have anything to hide. His face flushed red with anger or embarrassment or both. You think anyone will believe you? You think people won't see this as just a bride having cold feet and looking for excuses? I'll tell them you're unstable, that you've been acting crazy for weeks. Patricia will back me up. I pulled out my phone and opened the app Daniel had given me, turning the screen so Derek could see himself on the live camera feed. Say that again, I suggested. Tell me one more time how you're going to lie about me being unstable. Tell me how you and Patricia are going to coordinate your story. Please, I'd love to have that recorded too. He stared at the phone, then around the room, finally understanding that I had been several steps ahead of him this entire time. The calculation I could see happening behind his eyes was almost amusing. How much was recorded? What had he already said that could be used against him? What were his options now? You're making a huge mistake, he said finally, his voice low and tight. We were good together, Natalie. We could have had a great life. We were never together, I replied. You were running a scam, and I was your mark. That's not a relationship, Derek. That's fraud. He left then, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. I watched through the window as he got into his BMW and peeled out of the parking space with aggressive speed. Only after his taillights disappeared did I allow myself to sink back onto the couch, adrenaline draining away and leaving me shaky and exhausted. My phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. Got everything recorded. That went better than expected. He basically confessed on camera. Get some sleep, we'll regroup in the morning. Sleep seemed impossible, but I was too tired to do anything else. I climbed into bed still wearing my clothes, too drained to even change. My engagement ring caught the light from the street lamp outside, the diamond that had seemed so beautiful now just a symbol of elaborate deception. I twisted it off my finger and dropped it on the nightstand, where it landed with a small, insignificant sound. Tomorrow I would start making the calls. Tomorrow I would begin the humiliating process of canceling a wedding and explaining why. Tomorrow I would face the questions and the judgment and the inevitable people who would suggest I was overreacting or making a mistake. But tonight, I just needed to survive the night. I must have eventually fallen asleep because I woke to sunlight streaming through my bedroom window and my phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. Multiple missed calls from Derek's number, which I had blocked last night. Several texts from Grace checking on me. And one message from a number I didn't recognize. This is Vanessa Kent. We need to talk. I stared at Vanessa Kent's message for a full minute before deciding to respond. Every instinct told me this was a trap, another layer of Derek's manipulation. But curiosity won out over caution, and I found myself typing back a simple question asking what she wanted to discuss. Her response came within seconds, suggesting she had been waiting for my reply. She wanted to meet in person at a coffee shop on Northwest 23rd Avenue in 2 hours. I forwarded the message thread to Daniel immediately, and he called within minutes. His voice carried a note of interest rather than concern when he said Vanessa reaching out was actually a positive development. In his experience, the other woman usually had her own grievances and her own information to share. She might be looking to compare notes, to understand what Derek had told each of us, or she might be genuinely unaware of the full extent of his deception. Either way, Daniel wanted to be there for the meeting, positioned nearby with recording equipment in case anything valuable emerged from the conversation. Grace insisted on coming too, playing the role of protective sister. By the time I had showered and forced myself to eat something that tasted like cardboard in my mouth, she was already at my door with a travel mug of coffee and a fierce expression. We drove to the coffee shop together, arriving 15 minutes early so Daniel could get set up at a corner table with his laptop and wireless earpiece that would let him listen to everything said. Vanessa arrived exactly on time, and I recognized her immediately from her social media photos. In person, she was even more polished than her online presence suggested. Her dark hair fell in perfect waves over a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She carried an expensive handbag and wore delicate jewelry that caught the light when she moved. Everything about her presentation screamed carefully curated success. She spotted me at the table near the window and approached with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not hostile, but not friendly either. Something more complicated lived in the set of her shoulders and the tightness around her eyes. She slid into the chair across from me without ordering anything, folding her hands on the table in a gesture that seemed almost rehearsed. For a moment, we just looked at each other, two women connected by the same lying man, both trying to assess who knew what and what game was being played. Finally, Vanessa spoke, her voice lower and more uncertain than I had expected. I don't really know how to start this conversation. I decided directness was the only approach that made sense given the absurdity of the situation. Why don't you start by telling me what Derek told you about me? I suggested, keeping my tone neutral despite the anger simmering underneath. She flinched slightly at my bluntness but nodded. He said you were someone he was seeing casually who got too attached. He said you started planning a wedding that he hadn't really agreed to, that you were pressuring him into marriage because of your age and wanting to settle down. He made it sound like he was trapped in something he didn't know how to get out of without hurting you. The sheer audacity of his lies took my breath away for a moment. I pulled out my phone and opened my photos, scrolling to the images from his proposal at the Willamette River overlook. I turned the screen toward Vanessa, showing her Derek on one knee, the ring box open, both of us with tears in our eyes. Does this look casual to you? I asked. Does this look like someone being pressured? Vanessa's face went pale as she studied the photo. Her hands, which had been so carefully folded on the table, began to tremble slightly. When was this taken? She asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer wouldn't be good. Last June, I told her. Almost a year ago. We've been engaged for 11 months. The wedding was supposed to be in 2 weeks. Everything was planned, paid for, ready to go. Until I found out about you. She closed her eyes, and I watched her try to control whatever emotions were surging through her. When she opened them again, there were tears threatening to spill over. He told me you weren't serious. He said the engagement was fake, just something to appease your traditional family. He promised me that after your parents died, he was just helping you through grief by playing along with what you needed. The manipulation was even more elaborate than I had realized. Derek hadn't just been lying to both of us. He had constructed entirely different narratives, carefully crafted stories that would prevent either of us from questioning him too closely. He had made me believe Vanessa was ancient history while making her believe I was a temporary obligation. The precision of his deception was almost impressive in its cruelty. I pulled up the email exchanges I had found between them on his iPad and slid my phone across the table. Vanessa read through them slowly, her expression moving from confusion to recognition to devastation as she saw her own words reflected back at her. The intimate messages, the future plans, all of it laid out in undeniable detail. I thought I was helping him get through a difficult situation, she whispered, more to herself than to me. He said once he fulfilled this obligation to you, we could finally be together properly. That's why I was patient with all the secrecy. Grace, who had been silently supportive beside me, finally spoke up with barely controlled fury in her voice. Let me get this straight. He was engaged to my sister, planning an actual wedding with 200 guests, while telling you she was just some clingy woman he felt sorry for? And you believe that? Vanessa's defenses rose immediately at Grace's tone. You don't understand the history Derek and I have. We were together for 5 years before circumstances pulled us apart. What we have is real. What he has with your sister was always temporary. I felt something cold settle in my chest at her words, at the realization that even now, confronted with evidence of Derek's lies, she was still choosing to believe her version of events. She wanted to see me as the obstacle rather than recognizing we were both victims of the same con. But then I remembered what Daniel had said about the other woman often having useful information, so I swallowed my anger and tried a different approach. Vanessa, I said carefully, I'm not your enemy here. Derek is. He lied to both of us. He used both of us. And I'm guessing he's lied about more than just our relationship status. Something in my tone must have gotten through to her because her defensive posture softened slightly. She looked at me properly for the first time, really seeing me as a person rather than a rival. What do you mean? She asked. I told her about the financial spreadsheets, about the calculations Derek had made regarding my inheritance, about his mother's involvement in planning the whole scheme. I explained about his failing startup and his desperate need for capital. I watched her face as each revelation hit, watched her reconstruct her understanding of the man she thought she knew. When I finished, Vanessa sat in silence for a long moment before reaching for her own phone. She scrolled through something, then turned the screen to show me a text conversation. He's been asking me for money, she admitted quietly. Small amounts at first, a few hundred here and there for what he said were temporary cash flow problems. But last month he asked for $50,000, said it was a crucial investment opportunity in his company that couldn't wait. I felt my eyebrows rise. Did you give it to him? She nodded, shame coloring her expression. I took out a personal loan. He promised to pay me back within 3 months once the investment paid off. But now I'm wondering if there even is a company, or if it's just another lie. Daniel had been quietly listening from his corner table, but now he caught my eye and gave a subtle nod. This was exactly the kind of information he needed to build a fuller picture of Derek's financial crimes. I turned back to Vanessa and made a decision that Grace would probably argue with later. I've hired a private investigator to look into Derek's background and finances, I told her. Would you be willing to share what you know? The loan documents, the promises he made, any other financial entanglements? Because I think you and I both deserve to know the truth about who he really is. Vanessa looked uncertain, torn between her loyalty to the man she loved and the growing evidence that her loyalty was misplaced. If I help you, you have to understand that I didn't know about the wedding being real. I genuinely thought I was waiting for him to extricate himself from a complicated situation. I wanted to snap at her that willful ignorance was still a choice, that maintaining a relationship with someone you believed to be engaged to another person was morally questionable at best. But antagonizing her wouldn't get me the information I needed, so I simply nodded. I believe you didn't know the full truth. Neither did I. That's what makes Derek so effective at this. She pulled out a sleek portfolio from her expensive handbag and extracted several documents. The loan papers from her bank, showing $50,000 borrowed against her own assets. Text messages where Derek had outlined the supposedly lucrative investment opportunity. Emails discussing repayment terms that he had never honored. She laid them all on the table between us like an offering, or maybe an admission of her own foolishness. Daniel appeared at our table then, introducing himself with professional courtesy and asking if he could join our conversation. Vanessa looked startled by his sudden presence but didn't object when he pulled up a chair. He began asking questions with the same methodical approach he had used with me, building a timeline of her relationship with Derek and documenting each instance of financial request. What emerged was a pattern that went back years. Derek had been borrowing money from Vanessa throughout their original relationship, always with promises of repayment that rarely materialized. After their supposed breakup, which I now realized had been staged to allow him to pursue me without complications, the financial requests had continued but increased in amount. He had told her he was building something important, that he just needed temporary help until his big break came through. Vanessa had believed him because she wanted to believe him, because she had invested 5 years of her life in this relationship, and admitting he was using her meant admitting those years were wasted. I understood that impulse intimately, having nearly married him myself rather than face the truth. As Daniel took photos of her documents and made detailed notes, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from Rachel, our wedding planner. I had been dreading this conversation but knew it couldn't be postponed any longer. I excused myself from the table and stepped outside to take the call. Rachel's voice was bright and efficient as always, completely unaware that her carefully planned event was about to implode. She was calling to confirm final numbers for the catering and to discuss the timeline for the rehearsal dinner. I let her finish her list of questions before taking a deep breath and delivering the news. Rachel, I need to cancel the wedding. All of it. Immediately. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call might have dropped. Then Rachel's professional voice returned, carefully controlled but with an edge of concern. Can I ask what happened? Is there something we can adjust or rework to make this easier? I appreciated her trying to salvage the situation, but there was no adjustment that would fix this. I discovered my fiancé has been lying to me about fundamental aspects of his life and his intentions. The wedding can't happen. I need to cancel everything and I know that means losing most of the deposits, but that's not negotiable. Rachel's voice softened with genuine sympathy. I'm so sorry, Natalie. I've been doing this for 12 years and I can always tell when a couple is solid. I thought you two were solid. That assessment stung more than it should have. Even a professional observer had been fooled by Derek's performance, which somehow made me feel slightly less stupid for falling for it myself. Rachel promised to handle the vendor notifications and to compile a full accounting of what deposits could potentially be recovered. She estimated I would lose about $40,000 of the $75,000 I had put into the wedding account, but she would fight for every refund possible. After ending that call, I had to steel myself for the next one. Caroline, my best friend and maid of honor, deserved to hear this from me directly. She answered on the first ring, her voice excited and full of questions about the bachelorette party she was planning for the following weekend. Cutting through her enthusiasm to deliver the truth felt like a physical blow, but I managed to explain the situation in broad strokes. Caroline's reaction was immediate and fierce. I'm going to kill him. Actually kill him. Where is he right now? Does Grace know? Are you okay? The questions tumbled out rapid fire, and I could hear her moving around, probably already grabbing her keys to drive over. I assured her I was fine, that Grace knew everything, and that violence wouldn't help even though I appreciated the sentiment. What I needed from her was help with the other bridesmaids and their families, people who needed to be notified before they heard rumors or saw social media posts. Caroline promised to handle it immediately, to craft a message that was honest but dignified, to field the inevitable questions that I wouldn't have energy to answer repeatedly. By the time I returned to the table inside the coffee shop, Daniel had extracted a substantial amount of information from Vanessa. She looked drained but also strangely relieved, like someone who had been carrying a heavy secret and finally set it down. Grace was showing her something on her phone, and I caught a glimpse of the financial spreadsheets Derek had created about me. Vanessa looked up when I sat down, her expression complicated. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. I knew he was engaged to you, even if I believed it wasn't real. I should have questioned that more, should have insisted on understanding the situation better before continuing to see him. I was selfish and I'm sorry. It wasn't quite the apology I wanted, but it was more than I had expected. I nodded acceptance because holding a grudge against Vanessa wouldn't undo Derek's betrayal. We were both casualties of the same deception, just with different levels of culpability and awareness. Daniel closed his notebook and looked between the two of us with an expression that suggested he had formed some conclusions. I'm going to be straight with both of you, he began. Derek Anderson is running what we call a long con. He identifies women with financial resources, cultivates relationships with them, extracts money through various means, and then either marries them to access more or moves on to the next target when the well runs dry. The sophistication of his approach, the involvement of his mother, the way he manages multiple simultaneous relationships, this isn't his first time. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Vanessa looked physically ill, her expensive handbag clutched in her lap like a shield. I felt something cold solidify in my chest, anger crystallizing into determination. If Derek had done this before, there were other victims. Women who had lost money, time, trust, maybe even more than I had. Can you prove that? I asked Daniel. Can you find the others? He smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. That's exactly what I'm planning to do. I need a few days to dig into his background properly, but I'm willing to bet we'll find a trail. Men like Derek leave patterns. They can't help themselves. Vanessa spoke up then, her voice steadier than before. I want to help. Whatever you need, I'll provide it. He took $50,000 from me under false pretenses. He took years of my life. I want him to face consequences. I looked at this woman who hours ago I had seen as my rival or enemy, and recognized that we were now unlikely allies in exposing someone who had hurt us both. Grace squeezed my hand under the table, a silent show of support for whatever decision I was making. Okay, I said to Daniel. Do whatever you need to do. Find everything. I want to know exactly who Derek Anderson really is, and I want every woman he scammed to know the truth. We spent another hour at that coffee shop, planning our approach. Daniel outlined his investigative strategy, explaining how he would search public records, court documents, business filings, and social media histories. Vanessa provided passwords to shared accounts and access to email chains that might reveal more. Grace created a shared document where we could all upload evidence and findings as they emerged. By the time we left, it was early afternoon and I felt simultaneously exhausted and energized. The shock of yesterday's discovery had transformed into purpose. I wasn't just canceling a wedding anymore. I was building a case, gathering an army of people Derek had underestimated, and preparing to make sure he couldn't do this to anyone else. My phone rang as we walked to the car, and Patricia's name appeared on the screen. Derek's mother, his co-conspirator, the woman who had helped plan my exploitation while pretending to be excited about welcoming me into her family. I almost declined the call, but Grace grabbed my phone and answered it herself on speaker. Patricia's voice came through saccharine sweet and completely oblivious to what had transpired. Natalie, dear, I was hoping we could meet about the rehearsal dinner arrangements. I have some thoughts about the seating that I'd love to discuss. Grace didn't give me a chance to respond before she cut in with ice in her voice. This is Grace, Natalie's sister. There isn't going to be a rehearsal dinner, Patricia. There isn't going to be a wedding. Your son's scam has been exposed, and if you're smart, you'll get yourself a good lawyer because when this is all over, everyone is going to know exactly what you and Derek tried to do. The silence on the other end was profound, and then Patricia's voice returned, stripped of its sweetness and revealing something much harder underneath. I don't know what lies Derek's been telling, but my son loves Natalie. If she's getting cold feet, that's her issue to deal with. I took the phone from Grace, anger finally overriding shock. I found the emails, Patricia. The ones where you and Derek discussed my inheritance like it was a business opportunity. The ones where you congratulated him on getting me to pay for my own wedding. I have screenshots of everything, and my lawyer is very interested in discussing fraud charges. So you can drop the concerned mother act because we both know exactly what you are. I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking with adrenaline. Grace wrapped me in a fierce hug right there on the sidewalk, not caring who might be watching. I'm so proud of you, she whispered, and I felt tears finally break through the numbness I had been maintaining. The rest of that day passed in a blur of phone calls and notifications. My firm's partners were understanding when I requested a week of personal leave. My aunts, my mother's sisters, mobilized immediately to help with family communications. Caroline and the other bridesmaids created a coordinated response to questions that protected my privacy while being honest about the wedding cancellation. Through it all, Derek's calls and messages continued, growing increasingly desperate as he realized the extent of the damage. He tried anger, claiming I had violated his privacy and jumped to conclusions. He tried bargaining, suggesting couples counseling and working through our issues. He tried manipulation, reminding me of all the good times we'd shared and questioning whether I really wanted to throw away 3 years over a misunderstanding. I didn't respond to any of it. Every message was forwarded to Marcus and Daniel, adding to the documentation we were building. By evening, Daniel sent a preliminary report that made my decision to expose Derek feel even more justified. He had found 2 previous engagements that had ended abruptly, both to women with substantial assets. One had resulted in a quiet settlement after she threatened legal action. The other had simply walked away and tried to move on with her life. Daniel was reaching out to both women to see if they would be willing to speak about their experiences. He had also discovered that Derek's startup was essentially a shell company, more fiction than functional business. The few investors he had managed to attract had pulled their funding months ago after discovering financial irregularities, leaving Derek desperate for new sources of capital. Everything I was learning painted a picture of a man whose entire adult life had been built on deception and exploitation. A man who saw relationships as transactions and people as resources to be mined. A man who, along with his equally calculating mother, had turned romantic partnership into a profitable criminal enterprise. As night fell on what should have been just another day of wedding planning, I sat in my townhouse surrounded by evidence of Derek's betrayal and felt something unexpected. Not just anger or hurt, but a fierce determination that he wouldn't get away with this. That the women he had hurt would have their stories heard. That his carefully constructed facade would be stripped away to reveal the hollow, mercenary person underneath. My phone buzzed one more time, but this message wasn't from Derek. It was from one of the women Daniel had contacted, someone named Lauren who had been engaged to Derek 4 years ago. Her message was brief but powerful. "Thank you for reaching out. I thought I was the only one. I'm ready to tell my story if it will stop him from hurting anyone else." I showed the message to Grace, who was stretched out on my couch with her laptop, helping Caroline craft responses to the flood of questions about the wedding cancellation. She read it and nodded with grim satisfaction. He has no idea what's coming for him, does he? No, I thought, he really didn't. Derek had underestimated me from the beginning, seeing only what he wanted to see, a lonely woman with money who could be manipulated through false affection. He hadn't counted on me fighting back. He hadn't planned for the possibility that his victims would find each other and compare notes. He hadn't imagined that his careful deception would become the very evidence used against him. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, more difficult conversations, more pieces of Derek's true history coming to light. But tonight, for the first time since reading that accidentally sent text message, I felt like I was standing on solid ground again. The foundation of my life had been damaged by his lies, but it hadn't crumbled completely. I was still here, still standing, and now I was building something new on top of the ruins he'd created. Something that looked a lot like justice. The morning arrived with Portland's typical autumn drizzle, rain streaking down my windows and turning the city gray and soft-edged. I had barely slept, my mind refusing to quiet despite exhaustion. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Derek's face cycling through his various masks, the loving fiancé, the concerned partner, the desperate con artist caught in his own web. Each version felt equally false now, like watching an actor run through different character choices without ever landing on something authentic. My phone showed 17 missed calls from Derek's number throughout the night, each one documented and saved. Marcus had sent an email at 6 in the morning with a draft of the legal demand letter he planned to send, requesting return of all funds Derek had obtained under false pretenses. The language was cold and clinical, reducing 3 years of my life to a series of financial transactions and fraudulent representations. Reading it made my stomach turn, but I approved it anyway. Daniel's report arrived shortly after, this one more comprehensive than yesterday's preliminary findings. He had worked through the night apparently, driven by the kind of professional obsession that made him excellent at his job. What he had uncovered was worse than I had imagined, a pattern of behavior stretching back over a decade that revealed Derek as a serial predator who had refined his approach with each successive victim. The first woman he could document was named Lauren Mitchell, the one who had messaged me last night. She had met Derek 9 years ago when she was 28 and working as a pharmaceutical sales representative in Seattle. Their relationship had followed a familiar trajectory: whirlwind romance, quick engagement, discussions of shared futures. Derek had moved into her apartment, integrated himself into her life, and slowly begun requesting financial help for his various business ventures. By the time Lauren discovered he was still legally married to someone else and had maxed out credit cards in her name, he had extracted nearly $100,000 from her. Lauren had been too embarrassed to press charges, too ashamed to admit she had been conned so thoroughly. She paid off the fraudulent credit cards herself to protect her own credit score and tried to move on with her life. Derek had disappeared before she could take any legal action, leaving Seattle entirely and resurfacing in Portland with a cleaned-up background story that omitted any mention of his marriage or the financial devastation he had left behind. The second woman was Catherine Brooks, a successful real estate agent Derek had targeted 3 years before he met me. Their relationship lasted 18 months and ended when Catherine's accountant noticed irregularities in her business accounts. Derek had convinced her to make him a signatory on certain accounts for convenience, then had systematically siphoned funds while she was distracted with work. When confronted, he had fled, and Catherine had been left to rebuild her financial standing while dealing with an IRS audit triggered by the missing money. Catherine had reported the theft to police, but Derek had been clever about covering his tracks. The money had moved through enough accounts and shell companies that prosecutors deemed it too difficult to pursue criminally. She had recovered some funds through civil litigation, but Derek had declared bankruptcy and made collection nearly impossible. Eventually, she had cut her losses and tried to move forward, warning her friends to be careful of charming men who moved too fast. Reading these stories in Daniel's clinical documentation made me feel physically ill. I wasn't special or uniquely foolish. I was simply the latest mark in a long line of accomplished, independent women who had been targeted specifically because they had something Derek wanted. The realization was both humiliating and clarifying. This wasn't about my judgment being flawed or missing obvious red flags. This was about a practiced predator who had spent years perfecting his technique. Grace arrived as I was finishing the report, letting herself in with the spare key I had given her years ago. She brought coffee and pastries from our favorite bakery, the kind of comfort food that wouldn't fix anything but might make the day slightly more bearable. She took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug without asking questions, somehow knowing I needed that more than conversation. We sat at my kitchen island, the same spot where I had been reviewing wedding fabric samples when Derek's text arrived. That felt like a lifetime ago now, though barely 48 hours had passed. Time was moving strangely, simultaneously crawling and racing, each hour feeling endless while the days compressed together. Grace read through Daniel's report while I pretended to eat a croissant, pushing flakes of pastry around my plate. I watched her expression harden as she absorbed the details of what Derek had done to other women, the calculated cruelty of his approach. When she finished, she set the report down carefully, like it might explode if handled roughly. "We're going to destroy him," she said quietly, echoing the words from 2 nights ago. But this time, her tone carried absolute certainty rather than protective rage. "Not just for you, but for every woman he's hurt. We're going to make sure everyone knows exactly who he is." My phone rang before I could respond. Marcus calling to discuss the demand letter and strategy moving forward. I put him on speaker so Grace could hear as he outlined the legal landscape we were navigating. Civil fraud charges were straightforward given the evidence we had compiled. Criminal charges were trickier but not impossible, especially if we could get other victims to file complaints and establish a pattern of behavior across state lines. That would potentially bring in federal jurisdiction and prosecutors with more resources. Marcus had already spoken with both Lauren and Catherine. Both women were willing to provide statements and documentation of their experiences with Derek. Lauren was particularly eager to participate, telling Marcus she had spent years wondering if she could have prevented other women from being victimized if she had been brave enough to speak up initially. Catherine was more cautious but equally determined, wanting assurance that her involvement wouldn't expose her to further legal complications given the bankruptcy proceedings. The conversation shifted to the wedding account and the funds Derek had failed to contribute despite promises. Marcus explained that since we weren't married and I had documentation of the deposits, recovering my money should be straightforward. The challenge would be actually collecting it if Derek had already spent everything, which seemed increasingly likely given his desperate financial situation. We discussed options for making the case public beyond just legal filings. Marcus advised caution around defamation concerns, but confirmed that truth was an absolute defense. If we could prove everything we were saying about Derek, which the documentation made easy, then publicizing his behavior couldn't be considered defamatory. He suggested working with local media outlets that covered consumer protection stories, framing Derek's actions as a cautionary tale about romance scams. After the call ended, Grace and I spent the next hour compiling everything into organized files. The screenshots of Derek's text messages and emails. The financial spreadsheets showing his calculations of my net worth. The surveillance footage from the night he tried to explain away his betrayal. Vanessa's loan documents and text exchanges. Daniel's background report on Derek's previous relationships. Marcus's legal analysis and demand letters. Everything compiled into a devastating portrait of systematic fraud. Daniel called mid-morning with another update. He had located Derek's mother Patricia's employment history and discovered she had worked for several years as a paralegal before losing her license due to ethical violations involving client funds. The details were sealed as part of a settlement, but the pattern was clear. Patricia had her own history of financial manipulation, and she had apparently passed those skills and that moral emptiness to her son. He had also been monitoring Derek's movements and communications. Derek had met with his mother yesterday evening at her home in Eugene, a meeting that lasted several hours. After leaving, Derek had driven to Vanessa's apartment complex but hadn't gone inside, instead sitting in his car for over an hour before driving away. This morning he had attempted to access the joint wedding account and discovered his access had been revoked. Daniel's contacts at the bank reported Derek had become belligerent when informed he needed my permission to access funds, ultimately being escorted out by security. The image of Derek's world collapsing gave me a grim satisfaction that probably wasn't healthy but felt necessary. For 3 years, he had been in complete control, manipulating events and people to serve his purposes. Now he was losing that control, watching his carefully constructed plans fall apart, and realizing his victims were no longer isolated and ashamed but connected and angry. My work email pinged with a message from my boss at Klein Associates. She had heard through the office grapevine about the wedding cancellation and wanted to check on me. Her message was kind and professional, offering support and flexibility regarding my workload. She also mentioned, almost casually, that several years ago the firm had nearly hired someone named Derek Anderson before background checks revealed inconsistencies in his resume. They had flagged him in their system as someone who misrepresented his credentials. I felt my chest tighten reading that. My own firm had identified Derek as dishonest years before I met him, and I had never known. If I had mentioned I was dating him, if someone had thought to check their records, maybe I could have been spared all of this. But that was pointless speculation. Derek had been careful to keep our professional lives separate, never visiting my office or attending firm functions. He had probably known that closer scrutiny from my colleagues might reveal his inconsistencies. Grace was scrolling through her phone when she suddenly stopped, her expression shifting to anger. "He's posting on social media," she said, turning the screen to show me. Derek's profile displayed a new post from an hour ago. A carefully worded message about how sometimes relationships end and both people need space to heal, how he wished me nothing but the best and hoped we could both move forward with grace and privacy. The audacity was breathtaking. He was already trying to control the narrative, positioning himself as the mature party taking the high road while subtly suggesting I was the one making things difficult by not respecting his need for space. The comments were already filling with supportive messages from people who had no idea what he had done, friends and acquaintances telling him he was handling things well and time would heal everything. I felt rage surge through me, hot and clarifying. Derek was going to paint himself as the victim, as the reasonable person dealing with a difficult breakup, while I was left looking like the unstable ex-fiancé who couldn't let things go peacefully. He was counting on my shame and embarrassment to keep me quiet while he rebuilt his reputation and moved on to his next target. Grace saw my expression and nodded grimly. "It's time," she said simply. "We need to go public before he controls the story." I called Marcus and Daniel simultaneously, conferencing them in to discuss strategy. Marcus advised creating a comprehensive statement that laid out the facts without emotional editorializing. Daniel suggested reaching out to a specific journalist he knew at the Oregonian who covered financial fraud and consumer protection. Between them, they sketched out an approach that would expose Derek while protecting me legally. The journalist was named Kristen Walsh, and Daniel forwarded me her contact information along with a brief introduction explaining my situation. Her response came within 20 minutes, asking if I would be willing to speak with her that afternoon. She had dealt with similar cases before, she explained, and understood the importance of documenting patterns of predatory behavior. I agreed to meet her at a neutral location, a quiet restaurant in the Alberta Arts District that Grace suggested. Before the meeting, I reviewed everything one more time with Marcus to ensure I wasn't exposing myself to any legal vulnerabilities. He confirmed that as long as I stuck to documented facts and didn't make claims I couldn't support with evidence, I would be protected. Kristen Walsh arrived at the restaurant precisely on time, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and a direct manner that immediately put me at ease. She wasn't looking for gossip or drama. She wanted documentation and facts, which I had in abundance. We spent 2 hours going through everything while she recorded our conversation with my permission and took extensive notes. She asked difficult questions that forced me to think about my own culpability and blindness. How had I not noticed the financial discrepancies earlier? Why hadn't I demanded to see proof of Derek's business success? What made me trust him so completely? I answered as honestly as I could, acknowledging the ways I had wanted to believe in the relationship enough that I hadn't questioned inconsistencies. But I also pushed back on the implied suggestion that being trusting made me responsible for being defrauded. Kristen seemed satisfied with my responses, and her questions shifted to Derek's pattern of behavior with other victims. I provided her with contact information for Lauren and Catherine, who had both agreed to speak on the record. I showed her the documentation of Derek's calculated approach, the spreadsheets and emails that proved premeditation. I explained about Patricia's involvement and her own history of financial misconduct. By the time we finished, Kristen had everything she needed for a substantial investigative piece. She explained her editor would need to review everything and they would reach out to Derek for comment before publication, standard journalistic practice. She estimated the article would run within a week, possibly sooner given the timely nature with the wedding cancellation. Walking back to my car, I felt lighter than I had since this nightmare began. The truth was going to come out. Derek's carefully maintained facade was going to crack publicly. Other women who might have become his victims would be warned. It wasn't everything I wanted, but it was something. It was action rather than helpless anger. Grace had spent the meeting time drafting a statement for my social media accounts, a brief message that would go live the same day the article published. It was factual and restrained, simply noting that I had cancelled my wedding after discovering my fiancé had misrepresented fundamental aspects of his life and finances. It included a link to the Oregonian article and a note thanking people for their support while requesting privacy during a difficult time. That evening, Vanessa reached out again. She had been contacted by Kristen Walsh and given a statement about her financial involvement with Derek. She sounded shaken but determined, telling me she had also filed a police report about the loan fraud. Her bank was investigating whether Derek's false representations constituted criminal fraud, and she had hired her own attorney to pursue repayment. I felt an unexpected kinship with this woman I had considered an enemy days ago. We were both trying to reclaim something Derek had stolen, not just money but dignity and the ability to trust our own judgment. We made plans to stay in touch, to update each other on legal proceedings and any new information that emerged. My phone rang again, and this time it was Lauren calling from Seattle. Her voice carried a mixture of nervousness and relief as she explained she had just finished giving her statement to Kristen Walsh. Talking about what Derek had done to her had been harder than she expected, dredging up shame and anger she thought she had processed. But she was glad to finally speak publicly, to acknowledge that what happened wasn't her fault and maybe prevent other women from suffering similarly. We talked for over an hour, comparing experiences and marveling at how similar Derek's approach had been with each of us. The same lines about building a future together. The same gradual escalation of financial requests. The same way of making us feel responsible for his problems and generous when we helped solve them. Even his proposal strategy had been nearly identical, a scenic location at sunset, tears in his eyes, promises of forever. Lauren told me something that shifted my perspective on everything. She had done her own investigation after Derek disappeared from her life, hiring a private investigator who had uncovered hints of even earlier victims but couldn't track them down. She believed Derek had been running variations of this con since his early 20s, perfecting his technique with each iteration. I wasn't his third victim, she thought. I was probably his 10th or 12th, one in a long line of women who had been identified, targeted, and exploited. The realization made me feel simultaneously better and worse. Better because it confirmed this really wasn't about my poor judgment. Derek was a professional at deception, someone who had spent years learning how to identify and manipulate marks. Worse because it meant he had been damaging lives for over a decade with apparent impunity, moving from city to city and victim to victim without facing meaningful consequences. After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my living room and thought about all those unknown women. How many had paid off fraudulent debts rather than face the embarrassment of reporting them? How many had convinced themselves it was their fault for being too trusting? How many had Derek left financially and emotionally devastated, too ashamed to seek help or justice? Marcus called with an update on the demand letter. He had sent it via certified mail and email to both Derek and Patricia. Derek's response had come within an hour, a rambling message that alternated between claiming he had done nothing wrong and offering to negotiate a settlement. Patricia hadn't responded at all, but her attorney had contacted Marcus with a terse message stating she had no legal obligation to return funds and any further communication should go through legal channels. The attorney's involvement suggested Patricia understood the seriousness of the situation and was preparing to defend herself. Marcus seemed pleased by this development, explaining that having her lawyer involved meant we could pursue discovery more aggressively. If this went to civil litigation, we could subpoena records that might reveal the extent of her involvement in Derek's schemes. That night, I finally allowed myself to go through the wedding gifts that had been piling up in my spare bedroom. Each beautifully wrapped package represented someone's good wishes and expectations for my future, now all rendered pointless by Derek's betrayal. Grace helped me inventory everything, creating a spreadsheet for returning items along with polite notes explaining the wedding had been cancelled. Some gifts would be easy to return, kitchen appliances still in boxes, picture frames never unpacked, decorative items with gift receipts. Others were more complicated, monogrammed items that couldn't be returned, handmade quilts from elderly relatives who had spent months creating them, family heirlooms given as meaningful gestures of welcoming me into Derek's family. Those last ones felt particularly painful, knowing the family I thought I was joining had been complicit in targeting me. We worked in silence for a while, the only sound the rustle of wrapping paper and scratch of Grace's pen on the inventory list. My engagement ring sat on the coffee table where I had left it, the diamond catching light from the lamp and throwing small rainbows across the walls. Eventually, I picked it up and studied it closely for the first time since Derek had proposed. The setting was beautiful, intricate metalwork that had seemed romantic at the time. Now I wondered how he had paid for it. Had he actually purchased it, or was it borrowed, rented, or bought with money he had no intention of repaying? Had he chosen it based on what he thought I would like or simply what would photograph well for social media, another piece of evidence of our seemingly perfect relationship? Grace noticed me examining the ring and said quietly, "You should have it appraised. See what it's actually worth." She was right, though the thought of having it appraised felt unbearably sad. But it was an asset, something that might be sold to recoup some of the money Derek had taken. I added it to my mental list of tasks for tomorrow: appraise ring, finalize vendor cancellations, review legal documents, prepare for whatever came next. My phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. He had just confirmed that Derek's startup company was being investigated by the state for fraudulent business practices. Apparently, several small investors had filed complaints after discovering the company had no actual product or viable business model, just elaborate presentations and promises. The investigation had been ongoing for months but hadn't progressed quickly due to limited resources. Daniel suggested reaching out to the state investigator handling the case and providing our documentation of Derek's pattern of fraud. If we could help them build a stronger case, it might result in criminal charges that would carry actual penalties beyond just civil judgments Derek could ignore or evade through bankruptcy. I forwarded the information to Marcus and asked him to coordinate with the state investigator. Every piece was slowly coming together, a web of accountability spreading across Derek's various frauds. Each individual case might seem small or difficult to prosecute, but together they created an overwhelming picture of sustained criminal behavior. As midnight approached, Grace finally insisted I try to sleep. She made up the guest room for herself, refusing to leave me alone in the townhouse even though I insisted I was fine. Truth was, I was grateful for her presence. The house felt different now, contaminated by Derek's lies and the years I had spent living in a fiction he had created. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and tried to imagine what tomorrow would bring. More revelations probably, more painful discoveries about the man I had nearly married. More difficult conversations and legal maneuverings. More moments of feeling foolish or angry or hurt. But also, slowly, the beginning of something better. The truth emerging. Justice starting to unfold. The gradual process of reclaiming my life from someone who had tried to steal it. My phone lit up with one final message before I silenced it for the night. Catherine Brooks, the real estate agent Derek had defrauded years ago, sending her support and sharing that she had also contacted Kristen Walsh. She wanted to contribute to the article, to add her story to the growing record of Derek's predatory behavior. Her message ended with words that resonated deeply. He took so much from us, but he doesn't get to take our voices. Thank you for being brave enough to speak up. I read her message 3 times before setting my phone aside. Brave wasn't how I felt. I felt angry and betrayed and determined, but not particularly brave. Bravery suggested facing something frightening by choice. I was just trying to survive and maybe, if possible, make sure Derek couldn't do this to anyone else. But if speaking up helped other women feel less alone, if it prevented even one person from being victimized the way we had been, maybe that was enough. Maybe that was how you transformed personal devastation into something meaningful. Not by pretending the betrayal didn't hurt, but by refusing to let it be the end of your story. 6 weeks had passed since Derek's accidentally sent text message shattered my carefully constructed life. The Oregonian article had published 3 weeks ago, a thorough investigative piece that laid out Derek's pattern of fraud across multiple victims and states. The response had been overwhelming and immediate. Within hours of publication, 5 more women had come forward with their own stories of being targeted by Derek Anderson, each one following the same disturbing pattern of calculated deception and financial exploitation. The legal proceedings moved faster than Marcus had anticipated. The state fraud investigation gained momentum once multiple victims provided coordinated testimony. Federal prosecutors became involved when the scope of Derek's activities across state lines became clear. Patricia had been questioned extensively about her role in advising and assisting her son, and while she maintained she had done nothing illegal, her own attorney seemed increasingly concerned about potential conspiracy charges. Derek himself had gone to ground, deleting his social media accounts and apparently leaving Portland entirely. Daniel's surveillance indicated he had driven to California, possibly hoping to disappear into a larger city where his reputation hadn't preceded him. But the article had been picked up by several news outlets, and his photograph was now associated with cautionary tales about romance scams. Running wouldn't save him from the consequences this time. The wedding venue had been surprisingly understanding about the cancellation, refunding more of my deposit than required once they understood the circumstances. Other vendors had been similarly accommodating, with several waiving cancellation fees entirely. Rachel, my wedding planner, had gone above and beyond to recover whatever funds possible, telling me she was appalled that someone had used wedding planning as part of a fraud scheme. I had returned to work 2 weeks after everything fell apart, finding unexpected support from my colleagues at Klein Associates. My boss had shared with the partners what had happened, and they had collectively decided to cover the cost of my legal fees as a show of support. It was an extraordinary gesture that moved me to tears, this reminder that not everyone in the world operated like Derek did. Vanessa and I had developed an unlikely friendship through our shared experience. She had broken off all contact with Derek immediately after our coffee shop meeting and was pursuing her own legal remedies to recover the $50,000. Her bank had agreed that Derek's loan request had been obtained through fraudulent misrepresentation, and they were assisting with her case. She had also started seeing a therapist to process the betrayal, and she encouraged me to do the same. I had taken her advice, finding a counselor who specialized in financial abuse and fraud trauma. The sessions were difficult but necessary, helping me understand that being targeted by a skilled manipulator didn't reflect some fundamental flaw in my character. My therapist helped me see patterns I had missed, ways Derek had isolated me from friends who might have questioned his behavior, how he had gradually normalized increasingly unreasonable requests. Lauren and Catherine had both become important presences in my life as well. We had created a group chat where we shared updates on legal proceedings and offered each other support. Lauren was writing a book about her experience, hoping to help other victims recognize warning signs earlier. Catherine had started volunteering with a consumer protection nonprofit that educated people about romance scams. We were all trying to transform our pain into something useful. The financial recovery was ongoing but promising. Marcus had successfully frozen several of Derek's accounts and was pursuing claims against his few remaining assets. I would never recover everything I had lost, but the symbolic victory of making him face consequences mattered more than the money at this point. My townhouse felt like mine again after I had changed everything Derek had touched. New locks, new paint in the bedroom, new furniture to replace pieces we had selected together. Grace had helped me reclaim the space, turning it back into a sanctuary rather than a crime scene. The spare bedroom that had held wedding gifts now served as my home office, filled with architecture books and project sketches. Standing at my kitchen window on a Sunday morning, watching rain turn the city soft and gray, I felt something unexpected. Not happiness exactly, but peace. The anger was still there, would probably always be there to some degree, but it no longer consumed me. I had survived Derek's betrayal and come out stronger, more aware, more connected to a community of women who understood. My phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. Derek had been arrested in Los Angeles on multiple fraud charges. The federal warrant had finally been executed, and he was being extradited back to Oregon to face prosecution. Patricia was also facing charges as an accessory. The legal process would take months or years to fully resolve, but this was progress. This was accountability. I forwarded the news to our group chat and watched as responses flooded in. Relief, satisfaction, and cautious celebration from women who had waited years for this moment. We had done this together, turning our individual suffering into collective action that might spare others from becoming victims. Caroline called to check on me, her voice bright with genuine happiness rather than the careful concern that had colored our conversations for weeks. She wanted to plan a girls' trip, something fun and restorative to celebrate my freedom from Derek's deception. The idea appealed to me in a way that would have seemed impossible a month ago. I was ready to start looking forward again rather than dwelling in the wreckage of what I had lost. The engagement ring had been appraised and sold, the proceeds donated to the consumer protection nonprofit where Catherine volunteered. Turning that symbol of Derek's lies into funding for an organization that helped fraud victims felt like the right kind of closure. Some endings weren't about forgiveness or moving on peacefully. Some endings were about ensuring the person who hurt you never got the chance to hurt anyone else again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.